Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. We appreciate the fact that you chose us over a gazillion more things that you were going to do this afternoon. And I know our group is sometimes very slow of tuning in because this event is actually being presented to you by Jewish Russian Cultural Alliance, which is a part of the Jewish Federation of Greater Naples, in collaboration with the Jewish Historical Society of Southwest Florida. And this is the Soviet Jewry and The Moon presentation. It's being brought to you by Norm Winski, who is our main presenter today, and he is already connected. And Norm, I am going to say hello and introduce yourself, and please start the presentation.
Thank you very much, Marina, and our other hostess is Renee. They are with some terrific organizations. Be sure and you support them. So I'm going to tell you a story now. I got lucky in the gene pool with a fantastic uncle, which I think you'll want to learn about. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to my it's my mother's brother, and his name was Abe Silverstein, and he's the man that got us to the moon and saved Soviet Jews. A very unusual mixture of activities, but that's it. So, being this a Jewish organization, you might be interested in his family background. His father, Joseph Silverstein, immigrated from a little town, Krasnov, Ukraine, to Louisville, Kentucky, about 1890. Krasnov was back in the 19th century was a small town of 5,000 people, and amazingly, 50% of the population was Jewish. Joseph's father, Isaac, had a lumber business. Abe's mother, Eva, was born in Riga, Latvia. Eva's mother was from a Jewish family, and I don't speak Lithuanian, so I'm not going to do well with this Lithuanian city name, Ciala or something like that.
Ciao
Lith
life. Ciao
what?
life.
Oh, you know how to say that? Great. Lithuania, which was considered at that time the leather capital of Eastern Europe. That was the big industry there. And that's what her family did. They were in the leather industry. Eva's father, Benis, apparently the Eva's mom had, as a young lady, traveled, knew some people had traveled to Riga, Latvia, not too far away, and met the son of a rabbi. His name was Benis, and they went. I think the original family name was Tort, and then they changed it to Levine. And he was the son of the rabbi there in Riga, Latvia. Eva was born in Riga in 1883, and the family immigrated to Louisville, Kentucky, about 1885. Sadly, a few months after arriving at Louisville, Eva's mother, Ethel, died. Benis, being the son of an old world Hasidic rabbi, believed it was his religious duty to go forth and multiply, so he remarried. However, he learned that his wife number two was not able to multiply, so that marriage was annulled, and he went on to marry a third wife who was good at multiplication. They had 8 more children. However, wife number three was not so keen on managing all those children, so Eva, being the oldest child, was made to take up the slack and became their surrogate mother. You can imagine that Eva was looking forward to getting to the age where she could somehow leave that home and go off on her own. Her escape plan came to fruition when, at just shy of her 19th birthday, she married Joseph Silverstein on February the 29th, 1904. Joseph was 7 years her senior. Joseph was looking for opportunities to support his developing family situation. About that time, he received a letter from his Silverstein cousins in Terre Haute, Indiana, which had a thriving Ukrainian Jewish community. They told him that they were doing great with their furniture business and that Terre Haute's economy was booming due to the nearby coal mines. Knowing that Joseph was recently married and looking for a job or business opportunity, they told him he should move to Terre Haute, and if he did, they would help set him up with his own business. He took them up on their offer. Joseph and Eva arrived in Terre Haute in early 1905, and shortly thereafter they had their first child, a girl named Ethel. The cousins helped Joseph open a men's clothing store in downtown Terre Haute. However, Joseph did this out of a sense of duty to support his family. His heart never really was in his business or making money. In another time, in another place, Joseph should have been a college professor, as he was always reading and studying whatever he could get his hands on. During store hours, he was often in the back office studying. When a customer would come in and ring the bell, Joseph would be immersed in his studies and totally oblivious to someone seeking his help. Due to Joseph's obsession with studying and neglect of his business, the family struggled to survive as a poor Jewish family in Terre Haute. Joseph even conveyed their love of learning to their children, teaching that education was more important than eating. Unfortunately, Joseph lived that philosophy all too well, and his men's clothing store failed in 1926. Abe was the third child and only boy. He had 5 sisters. The closest in age was the second child, my mother Nell, who was 18 months older. In a typical Jewish family, education is everything. As you might guess, all the children in this family, male or female, were expected to go to college. This was in the 20th century, early 20th century, when most girls didn't go to college. After the store closed, Papa, that's what they called their father, Papa, got a job working for the city parks department as a maintenance man at a golf course. He told the family that is what he was going to do to pay the bills. My mom, Nell, child number 2, realized they wouldn't have enough income with Papa's new job. Her older sister was in college studying to become a teacher. Nell was in her first year of college, majoring in art. Nell volunteered to drop out of college, and she got 2 jobs so that everyone could eat and go to school. As a result, all of my mom's siblings eventually got to go to college and get a degree. Abe was a very smart boy, and despite being 18 months younger than my mom, graduated in her high school graduation class, apparently skipping at least 1 grade, if not 2. Joseph and Eva had very high expectations for Abe. They were constantly pushing him to do the very best he could. One day while in high school, Abe uncharacteristically returned home with an excited burst into the house and exclaimed, "Mama, Mama, I got a 99 on my test." Eva turned slowly toward him and said, "So, where's the other point?" Classic Jewish mother story there, right? With high school graduation approaching, Nell was adamant that Abe go to the local engineering college, Rose Polytechnic Institute, now known as Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology, that's in Terre Haute, and get his degree. As a result, Abe got his degree in mechanical engineering in 1929. Not knowing what he was going to do, he asked a classmate, "What are you going to do now that you've graduated?" The classmate said he was going to take the civil service exam, the test to work for the U.S. government. Abe asked, would it be okay if he went along? His classmate said, sure. Abe took the civil service exam and got a very high score. He got a job offer from an organization which a lot of people called abbreviated NACA, which stood for the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics. This was the government-sponsored group involved in early research for aviation and eventually became the forerunner of NASA. Abe was hired to work at one of the first NACA labs called Langley in Hampton, Virginia. His first day on the job, he thought he would take a walk around the facility. Being an aviation research center, they had a small airport which was adjacent to the lab building. He noticed there was an airplane parked on the tarmac, and apparently someone was working on the airplane because there were legs sticking out from underneath the airplane. He decided to introduce himself to the legs. "Hi, my name's Abe Silverstein. I just started working here." The legs scooted out from under the airplane, and the man replied, "Hi, I'm Orville Wright. Nice to meet you." Obviously, Orville Wright of the Wright brothers, right? So, to make a long story short, Abe was brilliant and solved many engineering problems that others could not. During the 1930s, his time at NACA Langley, he greatly improved the aerodynamics of U.S. warplanes, be on par with the German Air Force, and then he transferred to Cleveland in 1943 to the new NACA Lewis facility to be in charge of building the world's largest wind tunnel. During this time, he made major improvements to our warplanes to help with the war. He continued on this brilliant path, steadily rising through the ranks and by 1955, he'd risen to be number 2 at Lewis. We need a photo break now. I forgot to show you some photos that I have. Let's see, oh, there we go. I see him. Hold on, sorry about that. I found him. There we go. Okay, there's Abe's parents. There's Joseph and Eva. And they got married, as it said, February 29th, 1904. Obviously, they were married on a leap year, and so they didn't have many anniversaries. That's every 4 years, right? Here's Abe's college period. He joined a Jewish fraternity there in Terre Haute. There's a college picture of Abe from the yearbook and his activities in college. Here's an ad for Joseph's men's clothing store there in Terre Haute. And there's a picture of my mom, who was became Abe's sort of close confidant because she was closest in age to him. And here we have Abe went off to Langley there in Hampton, Virginia. And there's the whole crew there early on, all the people that worked there at the Langley. And there's a young Abe Silverstein early in his job there. One of the few pictures I have of him, other than the college picture, with no glasses. And the guy next to him is his boss, a fellow by the name of Smith de France, who became kind of his mentor there at Langley. There's a funny story. His first day on the job, when he met Mr. de France, and he said, my degree is in mechanical engineering. I really don't know anything about this aeronautical stuff or aerodynamics. And de France told him, "You're an engineer. You'll learn." There we go. And Mr. de France had been an early pioneer of aviation, and he actually was testing planes, and he earlier had been in a plane crash, and he was like the co-pilot, and the pilot was killed, and he actually lost an eye in the crash there, and so he decided he wasn't going to be doing much flying anymore, I think. Here's Abe. That's a fantastic photo here. They built some of the earliest wind tunnels there at Langley, and here's Abe. It's an actual picture of Abe in one of the wind tunnels, helping improve the aerodynamics of one of our warplanes, and so that we would be on the military people came to some of obviously, if you know the history, during the 30s, politically, we were in the isolation period. FDR said, we don't care what happens there in Europe. We're going to mind our own business. But the military people could not ignore what was going on there in Germany. And some of the generals came around and said, we're concerned. We see the writing on the wall. We're going to be probably headed for a war with Germany. And we're concerned about what the status is on our warplanes. And when they tested them, it was bad. Our warplanes were way behind the German warplanes. And so thanks to Abe and his colleagues, they brought our warplanes up to par with the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. Then in 1941, NACA built a new facility in Cleveland, and in 1943, by then, Abe had risen to number 1 there at Langley, and so they asked him if he wouldn't go to Cleveland and be in charge of building the world's largest wind tunnel. There's a famous guy there in high school. We'll get to him in a minute. All right, back to our storyline now, our printed story part. And they're near the end of World War II. Now we got to go off on a parallel storyline. That's what was happening behind the scenes. So there's multiple storylines that all kind of converge later on. So one of the storylines is that near the end of World War II, 1945, Hitler's top rocket science guy, Wernher von Braun, the guy who built the V-2 rockets that bombed London, realized that the Nazis were going to lose the war. He decided that for him to keep making rockets, he needed to find a new home. Mr. Von Braun was obsessed with building rockets. That was the most important thing in his life. And he would do just about, he signed the documents to become a Nazi so he could, so they didn't throw him in prison, and so he could make rockets and so forth, And then when he realized they were going to lose, he put his finger in the air to see which way the wind's blowing, and decided that he and his rocket team should surrender to the U.S. Army. And that's what happened. And so our military brought von Braun and his rocket team over to the U.S., and then they put on a big PR. They realized that he had a lot of baggage, bad history, and the U.S. Population, U.S. Americans may not be too happy with that we brought him over, but we needed his rocket technology. So they put on a big PR campaign to make von Braun look like a good guy. This was called you can look it up, Operation Paperclip. About the 1950s, they introduced von Braun to Walt Disney, if you can imagine, and they became good friends, and Disney began having von Braun on his weekly show every few months to talk about rockets and going to Mars. This eventually turned Dr. von Braun into a celebrity in the U.S. and on TV and in the U.S. And von Braun loved it. He had a big ego, and he loved the publicity, and every chance he got to go before a camera or meet with some reporters, he was there. Abe's personality was just the opposite. Abe just wanted to get the job done, and he didn't want to. He did a little bit of that early at NASA, and he got tired of it and just decided he wasn't going to deal with reporters anymore. And sometimes, literally, he was running from the reporters and said, "I don't have time to talk to you. I got to get my job done. That's it." So the 180-degree difference there in personality. Von Braun was actually such a publicity hound. He ended up being, well, I'll tell you in a minute, but he got hired to run the center in NASA Center in Huntsville. And he actually, when they have a successful rocket launch, they would have a big parade down the middle of Huntsville, and Werner von Braun would be the parade marshal, the head of the whole thing there. That's the kind of guy he was. So back in Cleveland during the 1950s, Abe noticed that many of the Jewish scientists and engineers who worked under him were asking to leave work early on Fridays so they could drive the temple for Shabbos to the only Reformed temple in the Cleveland area, which was about 1 hour drive to the east side. Abe told them they could leave early, but was annoyed at the loss of work. Abe was a workaholic. Everybody said they never saw anybody who could produce so much, work so hard, and produce so much work as Abe did. One day, and he expected that from all his people that worked with him. One day, Abe called a meeting in his office with his Jewish employees. He floated the idea of starting a Reform temple on the west side of Cleveland near where they worked. The idea was well received, and Abe went on to found the Beth Israel, the West Temple, in April 1958. If you go on their website, they tell you that Abe Silverstein was their founding father. During the early 1960s, some of the members of this congregation became concerned about the treatment of Soviet Jews and founded the Cleveland Council of Soviet Anti-Semitism. For about 2 years, it was a study group discussing methods to help Soviet Jews. However, by 1965, it seemed they weren't making much progress. The leaders of the group asked Abe if he would become their leader, and he agreed. From that point, success came quickly, and this was transformed into an international movement, which became the Soviet Jewry movement. I bet many people, if you're my age, you might remember the Soviet Jewry movement from the 1960s. He helped spearhead this. This led to changing U.S. foreign policy to pressure the Soviets to change their policy to allow Soviet Jews to leave the Soviet Union, and as a result, save the lives of thousands of Soviet Jews. Some of the scientists and engineers immigrated to the U.S. and found jobs working under Abe in Cleveland. One day in 1955, as number two at Lewis, Abe decided they needed to hire some new talent, perhaps recruit some college grads. One of his assistants, Robert Graham, had a close relationship with Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. He sent Graham to see if he could find some talented young engineers. One of the candidates who came for an interview had a very impressive resume, a former Navy pilot who just finished a graduate degree in aeronautical engineering. Graham said, "You seem to be a very promising young man, and I see here your name is Neil Armstrong." Graham recommended that Neil Armstrong drive the 350 miles to meet his boss, Abe Silverstein, in Cleveland. Neil met with Abe, and Abe looked over his resume and said, "You seem to be a very talented young man. I see here you want to be an NACA test pilot. That's your dream job." Neil says, "Yes, sir." But NACA at Edwards Air Force Base in California had turned them down, saying they had no openings. Abe replies, "Well, we don't have much work for a test pilot here, but I will hire you anyway. and see what I can do to get you the test pilot job you want. 9 months later, Abe contacted Neil and informed him he had gotten a letter from Edwards saying they had an opening for Neil, which eventually led to Neil Armstrong getting on the path to becoming an astronaut. Had Abe not helped Neil Armstrong, Neil probably would have gone to private industry and he never heard of Neil Armstrong. It's time for a photo break now. Let's go look at some pictures. Okay, we saw that picture. Here is Lewis in Cleveland. That's what they call the new facility there in Cleveland. And they see there. It became NASA later. And this is an aerial photo of it. And they had a huge hangar there, so I'll be talking about it a little bit. Here's a young Neil Armstrong in high school, fascinated with airplanes. Here's Neil's timeline. 1947, he enrolled at Purdue at age 17 on a U.S. Navy scholarship. That meant that he was committed to go to the Navy, and then he could go back to school, and well, he could go to school on their dime, but he would have to go also serve in the Navy. 1949, called to active duty, leaves Purdue for naval flight training. 51-52, serves as a naval aviator in the Korean War, flying 78 missions. August 52, released from active duty and returns to Purdue University. January 55, graduates from Purdue with a Bachelor of Science in Aeronautical Engineering, and then he applies to NACA Edwards Air Force Base in California, and he's turned down. And in May of 1955, Abe sends his recruiter there, and they end up signing up Neil there at Lewis in Cleveland, and put him on the path to becoming an astronaut. Okay, we'll be coming back to this photo here in a minute. It's an important turning point in aerospace technology. Okay, let's move on now. 1957, the Soviets shocked the world with their Sputnik satellite. This was the impetus for the U.S. to accelerate its space program. President Eisenhower decided to put all space efforts under one organization. At that time, the Army had a rocket program, the Navy had a rocket program, NACA was working on rockets. We had like 3 or 4 or 5 different rocket programs all going. Eisenhower thought that was crazy. We should consolidate them all under one umbrella. And they passed the bill to create NASA. Now, when NASA opened their doors on October 1, oh, wait, I forgot this line here. Abe was asked to come to Washington, D.C. to help this, and this helped plan NASA, and that became NASA. When NASA opened their doors on October 1, 1958, Abe Silverstein was the director of spaceflight programs, the top technical position in all of NASA. He was in charge of hiring all the top scientists and engineers. He soon was in charge of planning the Mercury, Jewry, and Apollo programs. He named Mercury and Apollo, realizing they needed all the help they could get. Abe invited, now think about this, Abe was a leader in the Jewish community, you know. Abe invited Werner von Braun and his rocket team, former Nazi rocket scientists, into NASA and put von Braun in charge of the NASA Marshall, the center there. They had a center there in Huntsville, Alabama. I'm sure you heard of it. The Marshall Center there in Huntsville, Alabama, to build the Saturn rocket. That would be the first stage of the rocket that would go to the moon, you know. Saturn ended up being Saturn V, was the first stage rocket. December 1959, there was a major meeting in Washington, D.C., the top NASA engineers and management. During the meeting, they discussed what should be NASA's plans for the next 20 years. The idea of going to the moon was mentioned. And then the question was raised as to what kind of rocket engine they should use to get to the moon. Abe's top rocket engine guy, Eldon Hall, spoke up and said, how about liquid hydrogen? The consensus in the world, just as a little side note here, so you know the technological background, the consensus in the world of rocket scientists was that liquid hydrogen was the impossible dream. They thought potentially it was the greatest thing that they could possibly use for a fuel, but they thought it was impossible to do it. It looked great on paper, but no one knew how to handle it. It required like minus 400 degrees temperatures to liquefy the hydrogen. And nobody knew how to do that without creating a major disaster. During the 1950s and culminating with actual tests in 1957, Abe and his team at Lewis had a major breakthrough building a successful liquid hydrogen rocket engine. However, very few outside of Lewis knew about this. So hearing the suggestion for a liquid hydrogen rocket engine, von Braun responded, "That is very dangerous. It will never work." Hall responded by saying that they had flown an airplane using a liquid hydrogen rocket engine, and it worked fine. Seeing that the consensus of the market had now swung to Abe's side, von Braun said, "Oh, if you flew an airplane with a liquid hydrogen rocket engine and it worked well, that's a different story, and I'm on board." Well, the von Braun, I didn't say this here in my writing, but in fact, von Braun agreed to that because he's a political animal and didn't want to be on the wrong side of the argument, but he didn't really believe in it anyway. But they went on. They believed him, and Abe got NASA to adopt liquid hydrogen rocket technology, would make it possible to go to the moon. And von Braun was put in charge of building the upper stage rockets, such as Centaur, which will be powered by liquid hydrogen. This was done at the NASA Marshall Center in Huntsville, Alabama. Later, Abe was in charge of selecting. By the way, Abe was at headquarters there in Washington during this period. Abe was in charge of selecting the Mercury 7 astronauts, which is what the book The Right Stuff is based on. You might have seen the movie. Tom Wolfe wrote the book, and then they had the movie. And Abe is featured in the book. They kind of left him out of the movie. They just in passing mentioned engineer number one, engineer number two, and he was engineer number one in the movie, and he's featured in the book with his photo. Then May 1961. Oh, this is a fantastic story. I'm going to tell you the story the way I first heard the story. When Abe told me this story over lunch one day, and you have to understand that Abe was this humble, modest guy, and he also was in charge of, kind of secret government projects. And so he didn't even tell his immediate family really didn't know much about what he did. He just knew he had been a top NASA guy there. He ended up being the director there in Cleveland, and they didn't know very many details of what he did. And that was his MO. He seldom ever talked about his job, but he moved down here, and I'm in Florida, and he moved down he had a winter home in Cape Coral, and we used to go meet with him about once a month to go have dinner or whatever. And we met him at his favorite restaurant one day, and he opens up and starts telling these fantastic stories. So he tells the story about how President Johnson, who was the real advocate, the big advocate, Vice President Johnson had been the real advocate of the space program when he was in the Senate and in the House. He was a leader in the Senate, and he got concerned. They got elected in office there in January of 61, and after a few months, Vice President Johnson had heard from some of his friends in Congress that we may have trouble getting funding through Congress for the space program. He contacted President Kennedy and told him this, and he said that we need to do. Vice President Johnson suggested that we need to do something to capture the imagination of the American public to make sure we get funding through Congress. So President Kennedy said, told Johnson, go see what you can do. So Johnson contacted the NASA administrator. He's the top guy, but the vice president is directly over the NASA administrator. And he contacted James Webb. You probably heard that name because he has the big telescope named after him now. And he contacted Webb and told Webb, and Webb really didn't know that much about all the technology, rockets and so forth, because his background, he is a corporate lawyer, corporate attorney, and he was a political appointee to be the NASA administrator. But Johnson told him, we're concerned about getting funding through Congress. See what your guys could do about capturing the imagination of the American public to make sure we get funding through Congress. Webb said, okay. And Abe tells the story now how Webb made a surprise visit to his office one day. He shows up there and he says, hello, Abe. And Abe says, yes, hello, Mr. Webb, and so forth. And Webb tells him the story about how Johnson and Kennedy were concerned about getting funding through Congress. And Webb asked Abe and his colleague that he was sitting with there. He said, what could you guys do to capture the imagination of the American public? Abe turned to his buddy there and turned back to Webb in about a moment's time. and said, well, he goes, and Abe, is an engineer, very understated about everything. And Abe says, well, we could go to the moon. And Webb says, okay, write it. He says, how long? Webb barks back, how long? And Abe said, we did some calculation over about a minute. And turned back to Webb and said, well, we could do that by the end of the decade. Webb says, write it up, send me our report. And so Abe and his buddy there Abe said they typed it up on an old typewriter over the lunch hour, send the report to Webb. Webb relayed it to Johnson, and Johnson relayed it to President Kennedy. And 4 days later, you saw President Kennedy go on national TV before a joint session of Congress and make the following announcement. And by the end of the decade, we shall go to the moon. Those were words right out of Abe's mouth, and they ended up coming out of President Kennedy's mouth, and that's what we were going to do over the decade. Later that year, NASA Director James Webb announced reorganization of NASA, which had put Abe directly over von Braun. Imagine that. We got the Jewish guy over the ex-Nazi guy. Abe was okay with that, I think, but von Braun, I think he had that was, as they say, a bridge too far. This would also in the new organization plan, Abe would have reduced Abe's area of authority. He was considered kind of the czar of NASA, all these rocket programs. He created dozens of NASA programs where von Braun only had one success, but we'll get in that in a minute. The word got back to Abe that von Braun was not happy with these changes and was considering leaving NASA. Abe decided they couldn't afford to lose von Braun, so he volunteered to transfer back to Lewis in Cleveland and fill the then vacant director's job. What a hero, huh? He had the dream job of all of NASA. Anybody who was in the aeronautical engineering or rocket science, or whatever, this was the best, the top job in that whole world, and he was willing to sacrifice that to keep the U.S. space program going. What a hero! What a guy! A few months later, NASA was getting anxious that von Braun had done nothing with the Centaur program, the upper rocket stages that go to the moon. Von Braun was suffering from that it wasn't my idea syndrome, and had been putting off doing anything with Centaur. NASA management sent von Braun a strong message to get going on Centaur. So von Braun got to work on Centaur and had a test scheduled for May the 8th, 1962. He invited many reporters and made it into a big media event. The rocket was launched and 58 seconds into flight, the rocket exploded. It was probably von Braun's greatest embarrassment of his career. Following that, von Braun, using his celebrity, tried lobbying Congress behind NASA management's back to drop Centaur. When NASA management learned of this, they were furious at von Braun and told him if he wanted to drop Centaur, he should have sent them a letter to that effect. He sent the letter, and now NASA was faced with a crisis that with no Centaur, no upper stages of rockets, the U.S. program could come to a grinding halt, and then perhaps the Soviets could win the race into space and to the moon. At that time, one of NASA's top managers was Edgar Courtwright, who had been an Abe protege. He contacted Abe in Cleveland and asked him to come to Washington, D.C. right away. When Abe arrived, they showed him the letter from von Braun, and they wanted to drop Centaur. They asked Abe if he would be willing to pick up Centaur and turn it around at Lewis in Cleveland. Abe agreed and said he would do it quickly. The Centaur documents were flown from Huntsville to Cleveland in a large cargo plane and taxied up the huge Lewis hangar. They emptied the cargo plane of its contents, which filled the big hangar. Abe and his team got to work and had a successful Centaur launch 18 months later. It was an engineering miracle, and they saved the U.S. space program. November 1962, NASA had a successful Apollo launch using liquid hydrogen technology for the two upper stages. In fact, it worked so well that von Braun was compelled to acknowledge that and congratulate Abe's success. Time for a photo break. Let's see, where's our photo? There we go. Okay, so backing up the truck here for a moment. Back to liquid hydrogen. This is the plane that they first tested a liquid hydrogen rocket engine on. They attached it to the wing of this B-57 bomber at Lewis there. They had the test pilot told the test pilot what to do. They said, now when you get to the plane to 50,000 feet altitude, flip that red switch there, and that will kick in our new engine there, and we can test it out. The pilot thought, oh, this will be really great. This will be really, give me a real boost. He had no idea how big of a boost he was going to get. And when he landed the plane and it worked successfully, I mean, it really jerked him back. And he was really shook up when he got out of the plane there. He couldn't believe how powerful that was. Talking about Abe and his mom, and Abe's mom ingrained in him, in his brain, to be a perfectionist. And he expected that from all his people. And he would periodically, if an engineer was working on a project, he was expected to come in and give a report and justify why he was doing what he was doing. And here's a cartoon somebody wrote to show what it was like to get reviewed by Abe Silverstein. The guy's holding his head and he says, I just discussed my paper with Abe. It's pretty funny. Abe Gift was known as a perfectionist. Here's the group many years later at the temple there that founded the temple. There's Abe in the background there. That's his wife. There's Abe. And there's Mary and his wife. And they had a little reunion there back in the early 90s, I believe. And there's all about, on the website there, they have information all about the Soviet Council on Soviet Anti-Semitism. Here's an early NASA, right? I think this is like just before NASA was formed. They had a meeting here. There's von Braun. There's sitting next to Abe, and there's all these top NASA. Many of these people end up being top NASA people there. And during this period, foresaw the entry. And so in the mid 50s, they had some meetings to try to think about what they should do. And there we go. And here's Abe talking to James Webb. And then here's where I'm going with this now. Here's a fantastic photo. Now, I told you that von Braun had this huge ego. He was not the kind of guy who would ever apologize for anything and so forth. And he liked, big ego. And so this is the closest we've ever seen anywhere, any von Braun saying that maybe he was wrong about something. Let's see, I have that blown up I think over here. Oh, no, wait. Oh, there it is, maybe. There we go. This is a photo after that launch on November 9th, 1967. Von Braun was so compelled that the success of the liquid hydrogen, he sent this photo of the launch to Abe. It says, Dear Dr. Abe Silverstein, to Dr. Abe Silverstein, whose pioneering work in liquid hydrogen technology paved the way for today's success. Signed, Werner von Braun. This was huge. This is one of Abe's proudest moments, that von Braun had to admit that liquid hydrogen was the way to go. Okay, and that made it possible for us to go to the moon. And they're still using liquid hydrogen today. Let's say Elon Musk, some of his rockets are using some other technology, but most of NASA's rockets are still using liquid hydrogen. July the 20th, 1969, you might remember that date, Abe's dream of landing a man on the moon was fulfilled, with Neil Armstrong stepping on the moon. A few months later, Abe announced his retirement following 40 years working for the government. He had turned down many job offers, which were much more lucrative, so he could serve his country. At his retirement, NASA officials presented him with a wall-sized photo of the Earth taken from the moon. At all the top NASA engineers, scientists, astronauts signed around the border. At the bottom of the frame, a plaque was attached which read, Abe Silverstein, architect of the U.S. program. And we're going to get back to the last little thing there in a moment, but I have to show you this photo here now. Let's see. Oh, here's the moon landing. This is down in Houston, Johnson Space Center, at the control center there. There's all the controllers and engineers in the control room, their mission control room there. And there's landing on the moon. And here we go. And then here's a few months later, Abe announced his retirement. They had a retirement dinner for him. And they presented him with this photo. That's the Earth taken from the moon. And you can't see it there because I guess they added it after the dinner. But all the top NASA people signed around this border here. and they put a plaque on the bottom there, at the bottom of the frame. I saw this in Abe's den in his house, and it said Abe Silverstein, architect of the U.S. space program. That's Mr. Cartwright, who I told you, the guy that called up Abe to come and save the U.S. space program. So there we go. Following Abe's consulting. We'll get back to the prologue. Oh, here in a few years later, February 71 was the 30th anniversary of Lewis there in Cleveland, and they had a little celebration, and Abe came for that. And here's Neil Armstrong, who owed his career to Abe and to Lewis, that he got him on the path to becoming an astronaut. There was the current director there. His name was Bruce London, and they were having some fun there, having some drinks and having some fun. And then we're going to get back to that in a minute. And so now we're going back to the text there. And I have to add, and my mom, Nell, is a hero of this story too. Thanks to my mom, who's the one in her family who did not get to finish college. She got 2 jobs and supported her family, including sending her brother to engineering school. We landed a man on the moon. Here's my contact information, but I have more to talk about here in just a minute. So let's go back here to the photos now. It's photo time. There's a little timeline for Abe after his retirement. Let's see. Here's something really interesting. In the early 80s there, Abe was working part-time as a consultant at NASA. And I went and visited him about 83 or so. And Abe seldom ever talked about his job, but for the first time ever, he started expressing some real frustration that they weren't listening to him. You might remember then what happened a few years later, January the 28th, 1986, was the Challenger disaster. I was in a room where they had the TV on, and they talked about, the Challenger blew up, and I immediately thought of Abe and what he had told me, how NASA was not on the right path, and they weren't listening to him. So 1997, Abe was awarded the most prestigious award in aeronautics, the Guggenheim Award. This is like the Oscars of aeronautics, and they have a very limited list there. Von Braun never got this, just to give you a contrast, but Abe did. In 98, his wife passed away, Marion passed away, and June 1, Abe passed away too. 2015, Abe Silverstein is enshrined in the Aviation Hall of Fame in Dayton, Ohio. And 2015, around this time, I alerted some people, his alma mater and so forth, that Abe was going to be inducted in the National Aviation Hall of Fame. And they had their homecoming, now called Rose Holman, his alma mater. They're going to have their homecoming, and they adorned the entire campus with these giant banners of Abe Silverstein as one of their most illustrious people. And since then, Abe is about in the last 20 years or so, Abe is becoming a national icon. His name appeared on the Jeopardy quiz game show clue board 2 times. This is back in 2010. There is about the let's see if I can read that. In early 1960, NASA Abe Silverstein gave Manned Moon Mission Program this name in the category, I think it was Gods Among Us, so about Greek mythology, and he named Apollo, and they kind of recycled that same thing here just a month or so ago. In November, NASA Director Abe Silverstein said he chose this name because the image riding a chariot across the sun seemed appropriate, and of course, that was Apollo. I'm producing let's see, we have anything else here on the other page? Let's see, oh yeah, okay. So now, I hope you found this an interesting story. I found a fantastic person, and I'm producing a full feature movie with some top-notch veteran Hollywood personnel about Abe's life and career. Abe led an exemplary life and is a great role model. He is truly a great unsung American hero. His story could help reverse the tide of anti-Semitism and provide inspiration for millions of school kids to study math and science. If you think you can help and you would like to learn more, please contact me. There's my contact information, Norm Winski, beautiful Naples, Florida, USA, 239-594-3939. That's 239-594-3939, or email me, nwinski NWIN@yahoo.com. That's NWIN at yahoo.com. Now I'm going to tell you how we can possibly reverse anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, the Jewish community is on the wrong track because all they do is say, don't hurt us, don't kill us, don't hurt us, don't hate us. And that doesn't work. You can't tell your enemies not to hate you because you have to change hearts and minds for the people to flip around. And then we have to convince people to love the Jewish people. How can we do that? Well, I draw the parallel as it's a little crass, I'm sorry, but it's we're in a psychological warfare and we have a marketing problem. The Jewish community is doing almost nothing about marketing our message. We have a much better, if you draw the parallel with the laundry detergent like Tide, and you have a good detergent and you have a bad detergent, but the bad detergent people are doing fantastic marketing. They're selling millions. We have the really good laundry detergent and it really cleans your clothes, but we're not telling anybody about why it's good. We have the much better product. Our people, you may know that 30% of the Nobel Prizes have gone to Jewish people. The big group that is getting a lot of attention, hating Jewish people. Their record is about 1%, and they have many more people than we do. So it's actually almost like inverse formula there. That they do not have a great message, but they are great marketers in brainwashing their people to hate Jewish people. Where are our role models? Our ads, our movies, our TV shows that tell why people should love people. Obvious example, Sabin and Salk invented the polio vaccine, saved millions of people's lives. If you save somebody's life, they're not going to hate you. They're going to love you. And if going to the moon, everybody loves going to the moon. Unfortunately, being a baby boomer, growing up in the 50s and 60s, because von Braun was such a great salesman for NASA, that was his biggest strength, really, going on TV and so forth and getting lots of publicity. Well, many people in my generation, the baby boomers, think that von Braun was the brains behind the space program, but it was really Abe. Abe created dozens of successful space NASA programs. Von Braun only had one. That was the Saturn V rocket. But von Braun, in people's minds, think it's von Braun. Do you want an ex-Nazi to get credit for the space program? Or do you want the guy who was a Jewish leader and who saved Soviet Jews getting credit for the space program? And so if we have enough of these programs, if I'm successful with this movie, I'm going to take a portion of the profits and try to create a TV series, Unsung Heroes. And many of our unsung heroes will be Jewish people. You might be on a Dell computer now. He's Jewish, you know. They got lots of people that people's lives depend on who are Jewish, but they don't know it. So let's turn this around. Let's reverse the tide of anti-Semitism and convince the people that they should love Jewish people, not hate Jewish people. They should love Jewish people. And also we can get school kids to study math and science in school. So please contact me. That's Norm Winski in Naples, Florida, 239-594-3939. That's nwinski@yahoo.com. And looking forward to hearing from some of the folks there. Looking forward to we can get this movie made. I got a 50-year. Oh, I got one more thing I can show you here. On my PowerPoint in Hollywood, they have what they call a pitch deck, which is like a PowerPoint. And here's our PowerPoint. We have a completed movie script. And here we have this thing here. We'll call the PowerPoint, where they have this kind of a slideshow. There's we showed you Smitty, and there's Eva, there's Joe, and this is all in the power. But here's my director. He's got 50 years experience. He's a very busy guy there, making lots of TV and movies. He just got an award at the area. Tom Logan. He loves this story. And he got an award at the LA Film Festival, just got an award at the Cannes Film Festival. So I got very qualified people, and we got some great contacts once we get this thing going. So please contact me. Where to go? There we go. And looking forward to helping some of the folks. Appreciate your help, and let's get this going. Let's reverse the tide. Go ahead. Go ahead,
Thank you
Marina.
very much, Norm. Wonderful information, wonderful presentation. I want to ask our audience if anybody had any questions. This is the time to ask them right this moment. While we still have a few minutes left for this presentation. But Norm, this was absolutely a fantastic presentation filled with so much important information, which I'm sure none of us really followed before or knew before. And I'm so glad we're recording it today, so it will be available for everybody who's interested to see in the future. I hope you will raise enough funding for your film and put it out. And I love your idea about the television series, or however, you're going to do your series with the unsung heroes. Wonderful idea. Hopefully it will come to fruition. So any questions from anybody?
I have a comment and a question, Lila. So the first one is, it sounds like a great project, and obviously I wish you well on that. You may be aware that the Wright brothers, actually their story has a parallel to the story of your mother, because the Wright brothers had a sister who helped finance them, helped publicize. She finished college, the rest of them didn't. And your mother is sort of that sister, like the Wright brothers was. And it's a tremendous parallel. If you go to Kitty Hawk, they have done a very nice job of remembering that sister. So let's not forget your mom. That's the first thing. I'm curious because I have a son who's an engineer who's involved in these kinds of things, shall we say. And but when he was thinking of going into engineering, my father, who was basically 2 generations older than I was, talked about how there was so much anti-Semitism in the so-called good colleges. And I do know parents of friends of mine who changed their name, who were Jewish, to get into some engineering schools. So did Abe ever talk about any anti-Semitism personally in that world?
Was that a question?
Yeah.
Oh.
Did Abe ever talk about, personally feeling or having incidents, anti-Semitic incidents?
Not that I know of. Obviously, he got involved in the Soviet Jewry movement, and
Right. No, but I meant
that was on a global level. But
Yeah.
I don't know that he ever had any personal anti-Semitism against him personally.
I mean, it's interesting that he obviously excelled in the government, where you're not supposed to have any sort of discrimination. Because my understanding is that a lot of private firms, wouldn't hire Jews, engineering firms, but whatever. But maybe that's why.
Sort of the flip side of that story is that here's what a mensch Abe was. That people tried to make something out of that. He was working with von Braun, and that they tried to make it into something. And Abe wouldn't talk about that. I went to visit Abe when he was toward the end of his life there in the 1990s at his home. And Houston, Johnson Space Center, historian had been calling to do an oral interview with Abe, and he wanted to dig up his Abe's relationship with von Braun and make it into some kind of a soap opera or something, I guess. And Abe, by then his wife had passed away, and he had like a caretaker there to take, active secretary and caretaker. And she answered the phone and told, "Oh, Houston's on the phone again. Houston's calling. Oh, I won't talk to those people. They just want to say turn something negative into my relationship with von Braun." All I'll say is von Braun was a very good engineer. That's all Abe would ever. Abe would never say anything negative.